Priti Patel.
And can I just say, it's a real pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady from Garston Hellwood. And I'm going to come on shortly to speak specifically about the Independent Public Advocate. We've been in touch about this in the past. There was a great deal to say, and I have to say that I do agree with so much that the Honourable Lady has said. I am really delighted, Madam Deputy Speaker, to at long last see that a victims' bill is finally here at a second reading debate for us all. And in particular, I'm also delighted to see the Right Honourable Member, our Lord Chancellor in his place. I want to welcome and congratulate him. And I would just like to thank the Minister, the Member for Charnwood as well, because I have found him so constructive on victims' engagements. And I find that just refreshing, because at the end of the day, I've spent time in government, spending a great deal of time speaking to individual victims. And he will also recognise, as will all Honourable Members, Right Honourable and Honourable Members of this House, the importance of doing that and the lessons that we can learn to be better legislators, to give them voice and give them strong representation. Now, I feel like I've been speaking about getting a victims' bill for some time, because, Madam Deputy Speaker, back in 2011, I proposed a bill through a 10-minute rule motion. So I think, you know, the day is long overdue. We've seen this commitment in manifestos in my own party and obviously other parties. And what I find so interesting so far in this debate, we've heard frustrations, there's no doubt about that, about how this bill has been drafted, what it covers, what it doesn't cover. I'm going to touch on that as well. But I think importantly, it is here at long last, and this could be a really important piece of legislation that will be amended, there's no doubt about that. But even from listening to this debate thus far, there is so much that we have to unite us on behalf of victims. We can work on so many aspects of this in a cross-party way, and I think we should seek to do that. I also want to really pay tribute to everyone that's been involved in this bill, but also the pre-legislative scrutiny, victims in particular. I have spent days, weeks, months with victims, and I would do that all over again as well, because I do believe that we have a duty to them in this House to represent them, but also recognise the pain and suffering that they have gone through as victims and how we can bring about institutional change on their behalf. There are many organisations representing victims who have campaigned hard. I've worked with many of them in my time as Home Secretary. I was once chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Victims. And also, I do want to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, who chaired the pre-legislative scrutiny draft of this bill. And my right honourable friends and members. Notice a member for my right honourable friend, the member for South Swindon, just walked in, just at the moment, to actually hear some important parts of this debate. But also my right honourable friend, the member for Esher and Walton, for their work as former Secretaries of State for Justice. I've had the privilege of working with both of them. On behalf of victims, but also on so many other aspects of government legislation, including policing, crime, court sentencing, the things that actually do bring about change. But we do recognise that this legislation is needed to provide more rights for victims, but actually more support for them. They are human beings, and trying to navigate their way around the system of the state. I've already mentioned institutional state failure, which I think is going to become a dominant theme throughout this debate, and I suspect through committee stage as well. It's really important that we recognise that, because our duty is to readdress the imbalance in the criminal justice system, where too often the needs of victims is forgotten, neglected, or ignored, or even just bypassed through process and bureaucracy. There's a ton of that in the system. I will, of course, give way.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, to my right honourable friend for her kind words. It indeed was a pleasure to work closely with her and Home Office colleagues, meeting victims, dealing with their problems in individual cases, and being very, very forceful about the agenda that we wanted to pursue, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does she agree with me that in Clause 15 of the bill, with regard to guidance for independent sexual violence advisors and independent domestic violence advisors, we are now, in law, recognising the invaluable work that these experts do, and it's shown that particularly in sexual violence cases, the input of an ISVA will often make the difference between a case going forward and a case collapsing.
I completely agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, with my right honourable friend. And there is always more that we can do going forward in this area, and there'll be lessons that we can learn actually from their roles. I do believe that professionals and professional practitioners should be engaged and listened to. In fact, my right honourable friend, the member for Romilly and Chislehurst, has already mentioned this in relation to Part 3 of the bill. And this is where we must constantly learn, because I do believe that at the end of the day, you know, we've all been shocked and horrified. I will highlight some cases during the course of this afternoon. The cases of victims, the type of crimes that they've been subject to, their treatment by the institutions of the state, how they've been treated by the criminal justice system. That needs remedy, and we have the opportunity now to bring serious redress to this. And of course, this isn't going to be judged by words or pieces of paper. It's the implementation. And implementation is what matters. And I've always focused a lot on delivering government, but that is about practical implementation. But this is where we can absolutely, this could be the game changer in improving public confidence in the criminal justice system. And all of us want that. This is not partisan. All of us want to ensure that access to justice takes place in that swift and timely way, that improvement to services and support for victims and crimes must be a priority. And I do believe progress has been made, and certainly, if I may just highlight one area, my time at the Home Office, the work that we did collectively, and I should say this collectively, both parties, through the Domestic Abuse Act, there was so much more focus on providing practical support and services to victims, and we should always put the victims first. Looking at how resources are targeted so that they can deliver the right kind of outcomes and support, including making sure that more rights have been enshrined in law through services and the support services that we put forward, and that is absolutely right. We've also seen, and I do think there is more that we can do in this area, the role of police and crime commissioners being much more focused on getting more help, and the Lord Chancellor has already mentioned this in his remarks as he opened this debate, where we can get more help to support victims of crime, and importantly working collaboratively across statutory services, which the Lord Chancellor has already mentioned. And if I may, I do want to give a positive plug to some of my colleagues who are police and crime commissioners. Roger Hurst, the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner for Essex, who is outstanding, he has put a very strong focus in his police and crime plan on supporting victims. He is an excellent commissioner, and my constituents across the county of Essex can absolutely see the changes that is bringing, and of course that's supported by Chief Constable BJ Harrington. I also met last week with Alison Hernandez, the outstanding Police and Crime Commissioner for Devon and Cornwall, and she's working with victim support. I have spent many hours, weeks, months previously working with victim support when I chaired the all-party parliamentary group. And again, there is first-hand experience that we can learn from those practitioners, and bringing that into statute and practice and empowering parts of our statutory services, including these key roles, is vital. And with that, the current Code of Practice for Victims, I believe, needs updating as this bill progresses through the House, because I think we do need to test these statutory provisions relating to the Code. I actually want to see and learn and understand how they can be operationalised for delivery purposes. What I want us to avoid is the whole concept of a postcode lottery, where some parts of the country do better than others, and we should absolutely be looking to drive consistency in outcomes and making sure that we have the right frameworks in place for accountability. And I have to say as well, sanctions, you know, where the state does fail. And I do want to come on to this when it comes to the independent public advocate shortly as well. So I'd like to see just stronger assurance, not just further assurance, but stronger assurance around the delivery of the code as well, and how this would work. And in fact, whether the Minister will, in due course, publish the proposed draft code or highlight areas where in the current code they would like to see some directional changes. Because I do, again, believe that we need to get this balance right for victims, where we can make sure the rights of victims are enforceable and they strike the right balance between rights and measures that we need to enshrine in statute, and therefore ensure that we are left better off in terms of outcomes. And this is where, of course, a number of victims' charities and organisations, again, supporting domestic abuse victims and survivors, or have a great deal of knowledge and expertise. Ensuring that we have a much stronger victim-centric approach to the criminal justice system is vital to make sure that we can drive the right outcomes. And I think on that point, Madam Deputy Speaker, Clause 6 of the bill rightly focuses on the criminal justice bodies, raising awareness of the code, but it doesn't necessarily include direct provisions about raising awareness within those bodies and ensuring that staff and providers who they may commission are even aware of the code when it comes to delivering the objectives, its overall objectives, to drive those outcomes. So I have no doubt that these areas will come under greater scrutiny during committee stage. But I also think when it comes to Clause 1, subsection 2, which refers to victims being affected by criminal conduct, we want assurances that the victims of antisocial behaviour are also afforded some of the rights and protections, we've heard this already, under the bill and the code, and the lines between what is criminal conduct and antisocial behaviour are too often blurred. And I hear what the party opposite says around antisocial behaviour. We all agree about this, but we have to be crystal clear in terms of the definition and then the applications within the criminal justice system, because antisocial behaviour blights lives and communities. That is a fact. But they also need the individuals, the perpetrators need to be held to account within the criminal justice system. And that is effectively what we are trying to do. But we need to make sure that the current code isn't weak in this area and that we have the relevant join-up that we absolutely need within the system. If I may, I'd like to speak about victim impact statements as well, because the bill and the code also need to examine how we can ensure that the voice of victims is heard in the courts. And there was an intervention earlier on during the opening of the debate where, again, a particular example was given where a victim was unable to provide a statement. And sometimes that is because the police, the CPS and the courts make decisions which do not necessarily focus on the victims. And this is where we absolutely have to get that balance between victims and offenders right. And this often happens when, I'm afraid, the process can act fast on behalf of offenders with complete disregard to the victims. That could be for examples of theft, burglaries, where a quick disposal and, if I may say so, lenient sentences prioritise over providing a sentence that reflects on the severity of offending and the impact on victims. I do have an example of one of Britain's most prolific offenders, responsible for hundreds of offences, including crimes against my constituents, was let off by the courts and let back into the community on a form of rehabilitation scheme. They were given housing and access to services, but still went on to reoffend. And the victims were not aware of this or informed until they saw the case in the media. And they were absolutely appalled by this because their views had not been sought, their views had not been heard about the impact of the offending on them, and it was completely ignored and dismissed. And if I may, I do think this is an opportunity for the Victims' Bill to actually shine a light on this particular area. And another area, if I may, where victims have been let down, where I think we could actually improve and give greater voice on behalf of victims, is the area of compensation. And where there may be scope to amend this bill in relation to compensation for the victims of crime. The courts have powers to issue compensation orders, so offenders can be compelled to pay for their crimes and give recompense to their victims. But sometimes these provisions, and in fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, too often these provisions are inconsistently applied. When there were the riots in 2011, which cost millions of pounds of damage, I asked questions back then to the then Justice Secretary about the numbers of compensation orders issued, and the data was not available. Now, I suspect there are many honourable and right honourable members across this House who have got many individual cases in their own constituencies. I have many too, and I've been to my own regional CPS, where I'm afraid orders have not been followed through, where there has been a huge sense of injustice. And back in 2011, I suspect there are very few businesses and companies, they were the ones that were left picking up the cost. But actually, when it comes to individuals, the crimes can be life-changing. They can be so severe, they can be so horrific. The failure to actually enforce these orders can actually lead to devastating impacts. And I have a former constituent of mine who was blinded by an abusive ex-partner, impacting on her ability to work. And not only did her partner get away with a short sentence, let out before the halfway point, but no compensation order was imposed upon him. And my constituent was left blinded in one eye, and that has changed her life, and she is a mother. And I have spent a great deal of time with her over the years, and it is a harrowing case. She sadly is a victim of our system, but there'll be so many other cases of this nature, and I very much hope that during the passage of this bill, we can just give light, really, to these types of examples and look at how we can represent those victims in a much better way and ensure that they are not let down by the courts or the CPS. I've spent many, many hours, in fact, with our regional CPS on this. And I do think we need to find better ways in which we can actually support individuals. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to speak about the Independent Public Advocate, which has already had, rightly so, a comprehensive hearing, both from the Lord Chancellor, but also from colleagues in the House thus far. I actually want to pay tribute to all colleagues across the House, and when I was Home Secretary, I spent a lot of time, actually, harrowing hours with the families of the Hillsborough disaster, but actually deeply fulfilling hours, if I may say so, hearing from them, and actually Bishop James Jones in particular, who is a remarkable individual. I have to say his report is moving but so thoughtful, where he himself has put forward great solutions, with clearly the honourable member for Garston Howard, and also my right honourable friend, the former Prime Minister, the member for Maidenhead, who spent a great deal of time with me, and there were other ministers as well who I worked with, really to not just understand this, but actually try to push forward the role and establishing the Independent Public Advocate. I absolutely welcome the provisions in Part 2 of the bill in the establishment of the Independent Advocate to support victims of major incidents. The tragedies of Hillsborough, they've been well aired in this House, but there are so many lessons, and in fact the Honourable Lady for Garston Hellwood has touched on all aspects of this, and I do not disagree with her at all. Hillsborough is literally, the history of Hillsborough is littered with institutional state failure. State institutions have let down those families, and there are so many phrases that I've heard through the discussions that I had with representatives of families, Bishop James Jones, from cover-up, from collusion, you name it, to state-sponsored denial as well, the role of South Yorkshire Police. The history of this is absolutely appalling. And of course, there are other tragedies. We've recently listened to the reports of the Manchester Arena bombings, and I, of course, set up that public inquiry. And every single aspect of that public inquiry was just devastating and harrowing. And I've also met with many members, family members, children, mothers, mums, dads, aunts, uncles, grandparents as well. And I genuinely think that there is so much more we could do as a government, but actually just in terms of the way in which we change our laws to bring parity to the justice system, to give them voice. That is just so important. And I saw that with Grenfell families as well. There is nothing more harrowing than going to meet the Grenfell families in the area where they used to live, their own community, and also to hear about the injustices that they have suffered. And I do want to pay tribute to all those families, not just for their relentless campaigning. They are campaigning for good reasons, but actually it's to give voice to their suffering, because they don't want other people and other individuals to experience the tragic circumstances that they themselves have faced. So during my time at the Home Office, we looked at this issue and the role of an independent public advocate sitting alongside the duty of candour. Which I absolutely support. I absolutely support this, because I do believe it will help to rebalance the system. The duty of candour itself would bring to light so much. It would shine a spotlight. It would completely change, I think, the whole ability of individuals to give evidence at public inquiries and safeguard their ability to give evidence as well, and really make sure voices are listened to. And this is needed, as there is an imbalance in the system, where victims and families seeking trust, truth, also assurances and answers, they're faced with what I can only describe as the machinery of the state. where they just feel intimidated. They feel that, and we've heard this already, they're told they're signposting over here, but it's totally inadequate, or it's the wrong kind of signposting. And they're faced by the machinery of the state, often tooled up with expertise, lawyers, and unlimited resources, and they themselves are grappling for resources, and they can't get access to justice. And I can just, if I may, just give an example from Essex, from my own constituency, where there is an ongoing inquiry taking place into the deaths of mental health inpatients between 2000 and 2020. It's incredibly disturbing and harrowing, and the type of cases that we're dealing with, but families have faced frustrations over many years seeking answers, and I actually believe that having an independent public advocate would help them, and I've been pushing this on their behalf as well, and had recent discussions with the Secretary of State for Health. But I genuinely believe that this could be a breakthrough moment if we are able to bring about the right kind of changes, and it may be through amendments, it may be through the committee stage. I feel that we can all work together on this to learn from the experiences, but actually from the tragic deaths that have taken place and the harrowing experiences, to ensure that we can actually make this an effective, independent public advocate role, and give it the independence that it needs. I don't want to dwell too much, but if I may, I would just like to touch on part 3. Part 3 has already been given an airing. I just want to speak to really the point I think that the chair of the Justice Select Committee has made, that there seems to be endless state failures in dealing with offenders. I've already spoken about institutional state failure on behalf of victims, but there has to be a stronger and better way in which we can deal with offenders who've been let down through, successive legislation perhaps in the past, or the way in which they are rehabilitated, or the fact that we have this just cycle, this revolving door of repeat offenders and offending taking place. And I'm afraid sometimes judges and the courts failing to send offenders to prisoners. There's a panoply of issues here that we do need to look at. The public and the victims of crime expect offenders to be sent to prison to serve their sentences, but at the same time, we also see that that often doesn't happen, and we also see that offenders themselves are just going through a cycle that is really not addressing any of their offending, and also effectively the costs of the state just continue to go up and up and up. I do think this part of the bill needs looking at. I do believe in firm sentences and fair sentences, and I've always been of that persuasion. But I also think we cannot have examples where we've all had it in our casework. Victims see offenders back in their neighbourhoods, they find out about it indirectly, and there are all sorts of problems that then take place in the community. So there are areas that do need addressing when it comes to part 3. Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may just conclude, I think this bill obviously is long overdue. This could be a groundbreaking piece of legislation to address so many of the inadequacies of the criminal justice system, so many of the historic inadequacies, quite frankly, when it comes to giving voice to victims of crime, and that's victims of all sorts of crimes. Crime is an awful thing for anyone to experience, but the severity of the type of crimes, ranging from the victims of the Hillsborough disaster, to terrorist events, to domestic abuse victims, but also to rape victims as well. We owe it to all of them to make sure that this victims' bill absolutely gives them the representation, the access and the rights of the criminal justice system, and we deal with those anomalies and imbalances. And I hope that we can all work constructively across this House to make sure we can achieve that.